No, there are two things in that story that strikes me, that piece you read. One is the position of jails in the Caribbean. And you go through the Caribbean and you find the jails located
right there on the water. Yeah.
It is just, I mean, some of the most beautiful views from the jail.
People will pay millions of dollars for those views. That seems like
the one that strikes me is the one in Grenada, where when they had that revolution, and they put those people there for about 15 or 20 years. And you could find a better place. The view of the sea is, but then I thought of the torture.
You can't touch it, you can't get to it.
And, you know, to be in there, seeing that and knowing that you could never go there. But that was where all the forts were.
Right.
Yeah. The second thing in your reading that struck me, and I wondered what you think of that, is the beating that the mother gave. Because I don't know if any of you read Colin Chandler's book, but in one of his stories he has a very strong story about his mother.
Do you know the story? I don't know what you're talking about. This is Colin Chandler?
Colin Chandler, yeah.
How to Beat Your Child.
Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Yes.
How to Beat Your Child?
Something like that, yes.
And I heard it performed by the actor who was inside of House Rules. What's the name of the actor inside of the black actor inside of House Rules?
That's a great title for a story, man. Wow.
Yes.
I mean, it's awful, but
yeah,
it's a great title.
It's a criticism that is often made toward the Caribbean community, that kind of corporal punishment that goes on.
Well, not just the Caribbean community. I think a lot of communities that are non-American communities that maybe are living inside of the States. You know, African American communities have to get the same criticism. Asian American communities get the same criticism. Yeah.
This is particularly true in Caribbean communities, and it's particularly true in Caribbean immigrant communities. And I wondered, sort of, were you thinking about that when you wrote that scene about the mother beating the child? When you said that she beat him until she was tired, and he had welts all over him. Was that kind of what was in your mind when you wrote that?
I mean,
were you thinking of it as a sort of a criticism, or just saying that this is what happened?
I mean, my personal feelings about beating your kids is be different than what Cooper might think. I mean, Cooper seems fairly, for the most part, unaffected by the beating as a character. I mean, he still continues to become a liar and a thief in his life. So he doesn't seem, it didn't change him in any dramatic way. And he still has positive feelings about his mom. You know, she sneaks in his marijuana for him. So although she punished him severely, she also then abates his criminal activity later on. So when I wrote it, I was thinking mostly about this character and what would create the grown-up that he becomes, and less about my own personal feelings. Although I should say that I do have social thoughts when I write. You know, I do have social intentions in everything, in every step I make, every time I talk to somebody on the phone, you know, in all of my activities. So I'm a socially conscious person. But I tried my best to honor the characters and not invade the text with too much of my own preaching. I'm sure it comes out in some way, but hopefully it comes out subtly enough where it's not too constraining on the character. So I was thinking mostly about him and how he becomes the adult that he becomes.
Yeah. So then would you say that you were saying in the story that this did help him?
I wouldn't go so far as to say that in a clean way. I might say that in some nuanced way it's possible that having a mom who's clearly giving him mixed messages. She's someone who would beat him for putting too much sugar in his milk, but would sneak him in marijuana when he's in jail, is probably the bigger problem than actually this particular act. But this kind of wishy-washy mother figure might have been a bigger problem. Right outside what you know, right? I mean, that's what we're told to write, I think, and often in high school or younger, maybe even, unfortunately, in some grad programs. Sorry for the grad students or professors who I'm totally overthrowing. I'll let you teach in your class, but write what you know, write what you know. And I feel like that's really boring, especially for the writer. And if it's boring for the writer, then I think it'll be boring for the the reader. So my advice always to my students is to write what you want to know, write what you desire to know, write what you're curious about. And if you write outside of not just what you're curious about, but what actually like makes you like, oh damn, should I do this? Can I do this? Am I going to do it well? Then you're going to be putting yourself in a state of bravery and a state of fear, which I think is really great. If you're on edge, if you're excited, you're pumped up, then your readers, I think, can be awesome. I mean, I don't think it can be if you're not in that state. So I guess my own little tricks for running outside of my comfort zone or outside of what I know is to follow my curiosity. So even in this story, the first one I read, for example, I had never been to Takashikara. I still have not been there. And I thought, well, I really want to know more about this place, and I ain't got no money. I can't get no plane to the island, so I'm just gonna figure it out, you know. And I think some of what I'm able to do in the story, made up or not, is coming from that place of tension, me not quite knowing, hoping, praying, crossing fingers that I was pulling it off and convincing Trinidadians that I have been there, right?
You did pull it off.
So I think that's one thing, to follow what I'm curious about, what for me sparks my interest and what I would like to know more about.
But do you think there's any validity at all in writing what you know?
Validity, sure.
Part of that that's valid.
I mean, yeah, I think it's valid, but I guess I don't think that it's interesting.
But don't you think that to some degree writers write what they know, in the sense emotionally, or what they feel most emotionally? That's, I mean, it's not what you know actually, not the actual things that you know, but the things that you are familiar. I mean, I'm just thinking that there are some stories that I can read and I can find them immediately inauthentic. The writer is making up a story, but it has no emotional center. And then you would read a story and where it has a strong emotional center, even though where the story is set, the characters may not be something that the writer knows and would have to research. But there is, so I mean, it's not something that I would say that you dismiss completely and say, well, you say write what you know, but write what you feel.
I still feel like maybe no. Because I think that even on the emotional level, writing what you feel, our feelings are so nuanced, so complicated, and I think especially for my students, maybe it's when I go behind and when you and I go behind and we write on our own, it's different. But especially for my students, I feel like even writing what you know emotionally, after what you know emotionally, is really flat. You know, you were in love with this guy and this happened, and you're gonna write about it, and I know about love. Professor Yanique, this really happened, but I don't believe it, right? Sorry. Like, you know, that happens, as those of you who have been in classes, you know that happens. But this happened to me. I'm telling you it happened. But it doesn't ring true emotionally.
I guess I don't mean it in that literal sense. Let me give an example. In one of my novels called Discretion, I started down it's about adultery. So I started down the road and I was going through that. And I started down the road from the point of view. Yeah, I started down the road from the point of view of the woman experiencing her husband
outside tape.
Yes, and I got bored. After about 20 or 30 pages, I said, my God, you know, I know this story, what the heck is it? So I turned the story around about something I didn't know. Why would a man who is in a good marriage, namely mine, with a good wife, namely me, with good children, namely mine, why, when all of that is there, why would he go outside of the marriage? And so from that point of view, I'm saying, you write to know,
right,
find out, but what's fueling it is some kind of passion that you feel strongly about. Yeah.
I do feel, a social calling to expose a lot of things. But I really feel strongly on some level, on all levels maybe, that my activist self, which is very large and passionate, and I am involved with many hippie liberal organizations and fight and take on man organizations and such, is a different part of my being than my artist self. I mean, it's impossible that the person I am, who does care about women's rights and cares about children's rights, will not flood into my writing, right? It's impossible, and I'm grateful that it does, because I think it enriches the writing. However, for me, it's really important that I don't hand in anything to an editor, to a reader, that feels like a pamphlet on domestic violence, right? So when I sit down to write, I never say, and I want to talk about how domestic violence is bad in the Caribbean. Never ever, because then I might as well just give a speech or write the pamphlet. I want to have characters, and my characters may disagree with me. My characters may not feel how I feel about women's rights, right? But I still want that character. For example, I have a character who's called Slick in one of my stories. The story is called A Street Man, and he's a drug dealer, and he don't treat his woman so good. She's around left and right, and I decided I would write from his perspective and make him really the honorable character. I wanted to make him real. In fact, I don't think I even set out to make him honorable. I set out to make him real. And the more that I dug into him, the more I realized that, he is honorable, because most of us are, even though when we're doing bullshit, right? Most of us have our core, have a sense at least of our own honor, right? So I realized that if I was going to write from him truthfully, that I had to write from him as a fully complex, nuanced character who thought he was doing the best by his woman, right? So I think what's interesting about what you're saying about Conchana's story, and for the record, to the camera, I never read the story. But one thing I think that's interesting is that what you're taking writerly or readerly critique to is the conceit of the classroom, right? But I bet you another writer, and I'm not saying that Colin, I don't know him at all, maybe in another story couldn't convince you, but there's somebody who could have convinced you in a story that a woman could have get up in the middle of a classroom and preach for 2 hours about beating a child, and you would have bought it. It's not the conceit, it's something else in the story. Because you read stories all the time where things happen, you're like, afterwards you're done and you're trying to explain the story to a friend, and the friend is like, the story is about a man who turned into a god? What? You're like, but for real, you believe it by the end. But it doesn't make any sense. So I think even the conceit is something that could be made authentic in the hands of maybe a different writer. At least 3 or 4 stories in the collection are multi-voice stories, where the story itself is being told by different narrators. We retold again and again, different perspectives, or different voices converge and the story itself gets revealed once you hear all the voices. And I felt not only was that interesting craft-wise, but it also seemed to me really important on a kind of social level, that as many voices as possible get revealed. And I was very conscious of the fact that there's not a ton coming out of the Virgin Islands as yet. I hope that will change. And wanting to reflect as many voices as possible, and not reflect them like just my voice, but small Tiphanie, old Tiphanie, teenage Tiphanie, which is what a lot of writers often do and do very successfully. But I wanted to go beyond Tiphanie. And in other words, of course, still coming through me, and the conceit is that it actually is still me, but as much as possible channeling other types of voices as possible. So that was a conscious decision that I made. Some stories that were originally third person became first person, multiple first persons, when I realized that, wow, community is going to make this story more interesting. And a godlike third person narrator or omniscient narrator wasn't going to be as successful as a community of voices. And that felt like a very kind of social activist move in the writing. Although, again, each voice is doing their own thing, and I'm not trying to impose any kind of particular social justice thing on them. So I believe in the MFA, as long as it has invested teachers, which I always strive to be one of those, and an invested community of other writers. And I came out of MFA that had a great community of other writers. And it was not in New York, it was in Houston. And I think in some ways because we were not in New York, we were like in love with each other and not angry and fighting for agents and editors. I didn't meet an editor until I had already graduated from my MFA. So it was kind of a really strong community, and many of those students, fellow students, have stayed with me as readers, even into the novel that I'm working on now. So I do think it has great benefit. That being said, however, I don't think one should ever pursue an MFA until you already know what you want to do. Especially if you're doing something strange. Which, if you're a woman, or if you're a color, or you're from somewhere else, you're done strange already, and you're doing something strange. Even if you think what you're doing is mainstream, it's strange because it's coming out of your body and out of your experience. That's strange. So often the workshop, which is about tearing you down, can take out some of the stuff that you're doing that is strange and interesting. And so my advice would be to never pursue the MFA until you are in a place where you're braggadocious enough to withstand the stuff that is not about you and your strangeness. That's good. And figure out like what in here is useful for me, and what is the people taking away my cool strangeness. If we can imagine, Jamaica Kincaid wrote this famous story, Girl. Anybody know that story? Yeah, it's a great story. In a workshop, it would have been torn apart, destroyed, thrown out a window. So the strangeness of it is what makes it this incredible story. And a workshop would have destroyed that story because it would have said, well, you don't have no dialogue, no character development, no plot. And really, there's no character development, no plot. There's no dialogue, but it's a fabulous story. So you have to kind of know what you're doing, I think, before you start the MFA, so that you have a kind of sense of yourself as a writer, and then you can kind of know what to take and what to leave behind.
You know, I tell my students directly, listen, you've got to teach yourself to write. I can tell you the craft, but you've got to, and I agree with what Tiffany is saying. I feel I'm very nervous when I do it because I don't want to break their spirit. I don't want to break their style. But then every now and then a miracle happens. And there were 2 miracles in my class last semester. I mean, one of the guys, they had to write 3 stories. And his first story was so amazing. I was just blown away. I brought him to my office and I said, do you know that you are a writer? He says, well, nobody's ever told me that. And I can tell you, I absolutely believe his following 2 stories were a result of his having that confidence that he was this writer, that someone told him that. And I think when you talk about that community, this is something that the MFA, because you're kind of like in a little bubble, and will give you a chance to. But I taught myself to write, meaning that I read. I think Stephen King said he reads something like 300 novels a year. And I'm pretty close to that number. I'm pretty close to that number. I mean, there is not a time that I am not reading a book, just constant. I think you need that fuel.
I mean, I definitely agree with the fact that books are the real teacher, ultimately. I mean, when you get into your first choice MFA program, which I wish on you, you'll have professors who haven't necessarily read what you have been reading. You know, that happens too. And so you're trying to do something and they don't understand the tradition that you're coming out of. So the more well-read you are in your little canon, whatever that canon is that you created for yourself, the better. Again, the more confidence you're going to have in the classroom. I know as a teacher, although I think I'm a good teacher, I try really hard to be when I know that I don't know where all my students are coming from. You know, I have students that are writing science fiction, and I know nothing about science fiction, right? So I have to let them know, hey, this is my weakness, and I'm going to try to come at you from a perspective of character and voice and dialogue. But you are the expert on your thing. You know, you have to be well-read in whatever is your canon.